Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling lessons from them that we can apply to our business and professional lives. So today I'm going to talk about General John Pershing. So he's one of the most iconic military figures in American history. He's probably not quite at the level of George Washington, who probably sits at the pinnacle, but he's certainly up there with Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, who actually served under Pershing, and General Eisenhower. I think those are probably the generals we think of most often, unless we go back to the 1800s and Ulysses S. Grant and perhaps Sherman. So what I'm going to talk about today is it's probably too short to call it an evolution, but the changes in how General Pershing fought the border war against Pancho Villa from roughly 1916 to 1917, and how he fought in World War I in Europe from 1917 to 1918. So they don't literally overlap, but they pretty much back up to each other. So just to set the scene a little bit, in 1916, the infamous Pancho Villa, who was an extraordinarily charismatic leader in Mexico, started raiding across the border into New Mexico, or really, I think New Mexico was already a state by then. It just had shortly beforehand become a state. And so General Pershing was given the responsibility basically to stop the raids. And so now, take you back a little bit, right? This is 1916. So the telephone did exist, although telephone service like we know it now certainly did not exist. And there were no cell phones or anything like that. Radio did not exist, so you couldn't be coordinating with your commanders in the field using radio. You really didn't even use telephone either back then. Telephone was between urban locations, but that was pretty much it. There was little, if any, rural telephone service. And in terms of warfare, we were at the very nascency in this country of what would later become known as industrial warfare. And so as a result, cavalry was still horse-based, and there really wasn't any significant mechanization of fighting in the U.S. Army. Okay, and then as we transition from 1916-17 to 1917-18, and we go from the U.S.-Mexico border to World War I Europe, right? World War I Europe was the first major industrial war, and it's called an industrial war because it's really when things like machine guns, poison gas, the airplane, the tank became a part of modern warfare. So going back now to Pancho Villa and the border. So in the fundamental doctrine of the U.S. military was one of maneuver and aggressiveness in battle. And Pershing believed that the most important weapon was the rifle and bayonet. Now, when we talk about a rifle with a bayonet, we're not talking about an automatic weapon. Okay, we're talking about pretty much it had multi a multi-shot, but you had to essentially cock the rifle for each shot. Okay, and so the aggressive spirit of the infantrymen was what was important. For cavalry, what was still preeminent was the short arm, like a carbine, and as well as pistols. Okay, and pistols were multi-shot now. There were single action pistols by then. In fact, in 1911, the 45 caliber automatic pistol became the standard weapon for the U.S. Army in terms of a sidearm. But excuse me. And then, of course, the sword was still in play. And in fact, Patton became master of the sword in the Army in the 19 teens because of the doctrine that he developed for training and use of the sword in combat. And in fact, he designed a sword called the Patton sword, specifically designed to be used on horseback. So these were the kinds of weapons that Pershing anticipated using as he approached his task of subduing Pancho Villa. Now, the fact of the matter was, he had a tremendous amount of autonomy. He was the final say. He didn't have to communicate with the Army Department back in Washington. He had no one in the field to whom he reported. He was, in every real way, the commander-in-chief of this military activity. As such, he got to set strategy, operations, and tactics. So, for example, when he charged Patton with scouting, which was a lot of what happened during the battles with Pancho Villa, because Pancho Villa was also a very mobile force. He was a guerrilla force. So the idea was, we first have to find him before we can attack him and kill or capture his people. And so it was a system of kind of guerrilla warfare against guerrilla warfare. And as such, Pershing's philosophy and the Army's philosophy of mobile forces, emphasizing individual initiative and aggressiveness, that all worked quite well in the battles with Pancho Villa. Now, one of the things that happened during the various battles against Pancho Villa is there was some limited use of motorized vehicles and the airplane. Now, the airplane was used for reconnaissance. It wasn't used for bombing or anything like that the way it was in World War I, but it was used a little bit here and there. They attempted to use it for reconnaissance. It wasn't particularly effective, but the idea was at least being played with. And George Patton, who at the time was, I believe, a lieutenant, maybe a captain. I don't recall his rank, but anyway, he convinced Montgomery, listen to me. He convinced Pershing to take him along on this action. And Patton is credited with the first motorized vehicle attack, if you will. So he used a car instead of horses to attack this place where he thought Pancho Villa was, and in so doing, he killed a couple of Pancho Villa's men. Patton was incredibly brave in this very short battle. Basically, on this vehicle driving in and with his pistol shooting a couple of people. It was a wild melee for just a few minutes, and it turned out Pancho Villa was not there. But this idea of fast, aggressive tactics was the emphasis, because they were fighting a very mobile enemy that much like the fighting with American Indians, this was all sort of cavalry-based mobile fighting hit quick and then disperse, hit quick again and then disperse. And so the tactics, well, the philosophy that Pershing had matched very well, or supported very well, the tactics that were necessary for fighting Pancho Villa. So, and that was why Pershing was successful in putting down Pancho Villa's raids for the most part. So, fast forward into 1917, General Pershing is put in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, and he's sent to Europe in April of 1917. Completely different situation. So instead of having complete autonomy, Pershing was, at least from the English and French perspective, the junior partner, because they had already been fighting World War I for 3 years, since 1914. And so they felt that they knew how the war had to be fought. And their intention was to their initial intention was to use American troops to infill their own in order to essentially resupply killed and wounded personnel. Pershing would not go along with this at all. He made an early decision that Americans were going to fight in American units with American leaders, and generally speaking, that was the case. Now, there were some situations where American units fought under French, sort of overall command, but the plan of the French and the British to basically pull apart the American Expeditionary Force and plug in, a few people here and a few people there and that kind of thing, that never came to be, because of Pershing's insistence of keeping his army essentially intact. By the time Pershing and the AEF got to Europe, the war had become a trench war, and you've probably seen pictures of trench warfare and the barbed wire between the German trenches and the Allied trenches, and all of the sort of horrible carnage that went on during World War I. That was already in place. Now, interestingly enough, at the beginning of World War I, and I've talked about this in a previous episode, the Germans had a very mobile army that swept through Belgium into France and looked very likely to take Paris. It was so effective, and the French army did end up stopping the Germans, and that's when it settled into this trench warfare. And so by the time Pershing got there with the AEF, he's looking at this really sort of standstill, essentially, and he wanted no part of it. And initially, he retained his perspective, the perspective, I should say, that he used on the border against Pancho Villa, which was the rifle and the bayonet were the supreme weapons. The individual initiative of his soldiers was really what counted, and fighting in trenches was not for the Americans. We weren't going to use artillery, tanks, planes. No, that's all nonsense. What really matters is a well-trained soldier with a rifle and a bayonet. And in fact, Pershing was so committed to this in the beginning that he transmitted back to the United States that all soldiers being sent over to Europe needed to be first and foremost trained in the use of the rifle and the bayonet. Now, the French and the English thought this was fou, as the French say. It was crazy. The kind of aggressive fighting that Pershing was advocating, they had tried it. It had led to horrendous losses. And indeed, one of the consequences of World War I for the British was an entire generation, basically, of British young men, especially among the aristocracy, were killed and or so badly wounded that they were, when they got back to civilian life, they were hollow shells of themselves. Estimates among the French were 25% of French men were killed in World War I, an absolutely astonishing percentage of men. And just to step out of the military for a minute, think about the social dislocation that resulted from the huge imbalance between the number of men and the number of women, especially since the men who were killed were marriage-aged men, men who would get married, would have children, that sort of thing, and to a lesser extent, the same thing for the English. It was just absolutely horrendous what happened. But going back to the battles, so Pershing was convinced that his philosophy would be better than what the French and the British were doing, and as a result, there were very heavy casualties among American troops, just like there had been among the British and the French in the early actions by the American troops. What Pershing came to see was, while he never became convinced that trench warfare was the way to go, what he realized was his rejection of the machine gun and of the tank and of artillery was wrong, and that these three weapons needed to be integrated into this open warfare, this offensively spirited warfare. And that's what was necessary to break the stalemate of trench warfare. And when you think about it, America was only involved in World War I from around April 1917 to November 1918. So that's roughly a year and a half. And really, Americans did not get involved in combat until the early part of 1918. And so they really trained in Europe for about a year, and they were in combat for about 6 or 7 months. So it was during that 6 to 7 month period that Pershing and his staff realized they had to adapt their tactics to the reality of industrial warfare. And so they embedded machine gun teams into their small units. They created, well, not so much created, but they adapted a strategy of using artillery in a sort of rolling barrage that infantry followed closely behind. And so the barrages would basically stun the enemy. And so when the Americans attacked, they could be effective because they weren't getting wiped out by an enemy sitting in trenches with machine guns to just wipe them out. And another thing was that the basically creation of tank warfare, the replacement of horses by tanks, so that by the end of World War I, cavalry now was essentially an armored function as opposed to a horse-based function. And again, Patton was instrumental in developing tank warfare in World War I, and indeed became probably the greatest, well, not probably, the greatest Army commander in World War II because of his skill with tanks and the aggressive spirit that he learned, at least in part, from being a subordinate to Pershing. So in a relatively short time, Pershing had to adapt his tactics in order to be successful on the battlefield during World War I. So And by the way, there were other areas where he had to adapt as well. So first of all, as I mentioned, when he was fighting Pancho Villa, he was in sole command. When he got to Europe, war became as much well, I shouldn't say a political war is always political, but the role of a commander in war, a senior commander in war in World War One, Pershing had to be as much a politician in essence, dealing with his counterparts in the French and English armies, as he did a battlefield commander, and perhaps more so. So he as the commander in chief of the American Expeditionary Force, he was not a battlefield commander. His job was to coordinate with the French and the English in order to see to it that there was a coordinated Allied effort, and so that too was a very different, and Patton had to adapt how he handled things in order to be successful as sort of one of three, if you will, significant commanders within the Allied overall military effort. And as the kid late to the party, so to speak, right, he had to deal with the, I don't want to call it arrogance of the English and the French, but they'd been bleeding for years before Pershing got there. They were confident in what they knew about how the war needed to be fought. And so Pershing had to, on the one hand, get along with his fellow commanders while at the same time hold to his strategic vision while he adapted his tactics and learned from the French and the British to fight an industrialized war more effectively. So as well, he had to deal with a whole different logistics situation. So if you can imagine, warfare, even going back to the 1800s, well, I mean, okay, you had artillery, you had cannons, you had to have cannonballs, chain shot, whatever it was that the cannons were firing, gunpowder, you had to have your small arms. In terms of technological logistics, that was pretty much it. Now, trains were an important part of the Union Army effort in the Civil War, but beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot you dealt with in terms of technology, and that was still largely true in 1916 when Pershing was fighting the border conflict with Pancho Villa. So, although he did use some motorized vehicles, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, he did use a couple of aircraft. I mean, very little. Okay, no, machine guns and that kind of thing. There just was not that kind of technology used. So your main logistical concerns at that time were food for your men and your horses, and medical supplies, and then ammunition. That was pretty much it. By the time Pershing got to World War One, logistics became much more complicated. So you had air forces. They were called air corps it was called the American Army Air Corps. Actually, it was called the Air Service during World War One. America did not supply any aircraft in World War One. They used British and French aircraft. But the whole logistical aspect of supplying an air service, much greater than anything that had gone on before. Tanks, again, tanks required spare parts. They required petrol, gasoline. They required ammunition. They required, oil and all the things to maintain them. Again, nothing like that was required prior to that. Machine guns, okay, aside from requiring a much larger supply of ammunition because their rate of fire was so high, Also, machine guns were a more complex technology, so you needed spare parts. They did break down, so you needed to have replacements. Again, a much bigger logistical challenge. And because armies were so much bigger, so the AEF eventually numbered over 1 million men. So the regular logistics of food and medical supplies and all of that was so much greater than anything that had gone on before. It was a truly daunting challenge for Pershing and his staff. He was very lucky to have Colonel George Marshall, who of course later became Army Chief of Staff at the time of World War II. Well, he was Army Chief of Staff before World War II, but during World War II, he was Army Chief of Staff. So Pershing was fortunate to have Marshall, on his staff, because a lot of the plans and the dealing with logistics, Marshall excelled at that. But it was a whole new logistical world as well. And again, the British and French had been dealing with that for several years by the time Pershing and the AEF got to Europe, but this was all brand new to the AEF, and so they had to figure out how was all of this going to happen. So, what are then the lessons for us in business as we look at how Pershing adapted his tactics from the border conflict with Pancho Villa and going into World War I? By the way, let me one more thing before I actually get to that. One thing it's interesting to note is as warfare continued to adapt in the interwar years and then into World War II, what the German army or the Nazi army called the Blitzkrieg became the most significant force in World War II, especially in the beginning of the war, with the combined arms of army, artillery, aircraft, all working together in the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Germany was able to sweep through Belgium and Holland and into France, and essentially they didn't literally conquer France, but they were able to take Paris and just blast through French the standing defenses that the French had built after World War I. In the face of Blitzkrieg, they meant nothing, because by then the German army had perfected this idea of open warfare, and it was what Patton II had spent his time in the intervening war years also perfecting, and it was why he became such a brilliant field commander during World War II. So what Pershing advocated for during World War I became the dominant strategy and the tactical way of fighting war as we continue on in history into World War II. So what lessons do we learn from this for our businesses, right? So, don't go to a knife fight or a gunfight with a knife, right? It's a line from The Godfather, I believe. Well, here's the thing. We do need to keep up with technological change. There's no doubt that we do. So I remember when cell phones came onto the scene, right? And they were very quickly adapted into business, because they made communication with colleagues so much easier, right? Pagers were fine, but all pagers could do would say, find a phone and call me, right? But cell phones, I think it's reasonable to say, and I don't use this word lightly, revolutionized how business was done. So for the current challenge is AI. So the idea that we can sit back and ignore AI, I think is fallacious. We need to be actively looking at how can we bring AI into our businesses in a productive way, in a way that will allow us to pursue our strategies, our strategy more effectively. Now, the danger is if we look at how other people are using new technology, we may be tempted to adjust our strategy in order to be able to adopt the tactics they're using with new technology. And this is, I think, the heart of the lesson of Pershing's adaptation from the border war with Pancho Villa to World War I. And that is, he recognized that his strategy was still sound. So open warfare, mobile, quick to react, overwhelm the enemy, stay very, quote unquote, light on your feet so that you can take advantage of enemy weakness as quickly as possible. That was the strategy that Pershing had in the border conflicts with Pancho Villa, and that was the strategy he maintained in World War I, despite the pressure he got from the British and the French to basically adopt the trench war strategy. So strategy stayed the same. It was sound, and he knew it was sound, or he had confidence it was sound. What he had to do was figure out, okay, these new technological systems, these new weapons, how do I use them effectively in pursuing the strategy that I'm convinced is the strategy that will be effective? And we need to do the same thing in our businesses and professions. So assuming we're confident in our strategy, then how do we adapt different and new technologies to work for our strategy, not adopting other people's tactics and changing our strategy? Okay, especially if they're in a different business, their strategy may not be applicable to our business. Okay, and so for example, how retail businesses use social media, completely different than how a professional like me, who's really more of a business to business person, how I need to use social media, right? Blasting out to millions of people does nothing for me. Brand awareness is of no value to me at all. What's important for me is to use technology to reach the people that are most likely to want to do business with me as part of a team. Okay, so that's how I need to use new technology. And as I look at how I can use AI in my practice, it's with the same strategy. Okay, everything in my business is, how do I meet the key people, the key professionals with whom I need to work together with them so we can build our practices together, right? Raise the tide for all of us. That's completely different than how a retail business should be looking at the use of technology and AI, because to go after one customer at a time, it's not going to work, because they need, especially a mass market retail business, okay, they really need to be bringing people into their stores or onto their websites in large numbers in order to get the number of sales that are required. Okay, so this is what I want to leave you with, and that is, as you look at changes in technology, and AI really is this real significant change that we're dealing with right now. How do you use AI to support the strategies you're already using that are helping your business grow? Now, if your strategy is not working, don't bother taking the time to adapt AI to it, because if the strategy isn't the right strategy, then it's not going to work. And if you look at how the French and the British were fighting trench warfare, it was a stalemate. They could have spent all the time they wanted adapting the use of artillery and machine guns and such. It was still a stalemate. It had been a stalemate for basically 3 years, 2.5 years, right? It took Pershing to come in with a different strategy to which he adapted his tactics to help break through and eventually bring about Allied victory in World War I. Okay, so that's our show for today. A little bit shorter than they've been recently, but I only want to take the amount of time necessary to convey to you the idea or ideas that will be most useful for your business and professional practices. So tomorrow, on Wednesday at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to be talking about developing routines for success. And to help do that, I'm going to be talking about a book by Charles Duhigg called, all of a sudden I went up on the name of the book, Habit, The Power of Habit, sorry. It's a wonderful book, one of my favorite. It's not necessarily a business book per se. It's a self-development book, and so I'm gonna talk about that. But we really want to routinize powerful behaviors in order to drive our business and professional success. So that's tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific time on People Making Money, and then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. my show, Trust and Estates Weekly, and I think I have a guest, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, my guest is Jacqueline Yu, and Jacqueline is going to be talking about complex issues in trusts and estates and probates. So Jacqueline is a very high-level attorney. She has a great deal of experience, a very broad and in-depth view of legal practice in this area. And so I hope you will join Jacqueline and me on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to hear her thoughts on these various issues. And then a week from today, we'll be back with the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So before I forget, if you are not a subscriber to our YouTube channel, please do consider subscribing. That way, you'll always get a reminder whenever there's a new episode posting, and so you'll keep abreast of that. And also, please do consider subscribing to my email list, especially for my every other week show, Jiggers' Place, where we have a cocktail and talk about non-business topics. If you want a recipe to the cocktail in advance, I email that out before the show, and so you can make yourself a cocktail while I make one, and we can sit back and enjoy the same drink together. So if you want to subscribe to my email list, please go to my website, bemel.com, BEMEL.com. Scroll all the way to the bottom, and you'll see where you can just fill in your email address and click, I think it's subscribe, and you'll be added to the list, and would love to have you. I don't overwhelm you with emails, just really one email before a couple of hours before each episode airs to remind you that the show is coming up, and in the case of Jiggers' Place, to give you the recipe for the cocktail for that week. So thank you very much for joining me. Deeply appreciate it. Would love to hear your comments, good, bad, indifferent. So social media links will be in the show notes after this episode posts. And wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. Courage at all times, my friends. And Marie, you are my belle.